let's talk about what's happening in the Middle East right now in West Asia, because we have Israel all over the news at the moment with
Yeah.
its murder of several top Iranian military personnel generals in
Not
Syria.
the Russian government has called this a terrorist act, which is
Right.
the strongest criticism of Israel that has ever come out of Russia since,
Right. At the
since the
United
Soviet.
Nations and elsewhere, right? That every top official in the United Nations from Russia Russian representatives have called this and condemned this as a terror attack. It's huge. I mean, it's huge in it. And I wanted to get your reaction to what's been going on, because it's not only this, there's the uproar. The United States is not really uproaring, at least when it comes to official Washington. They're not uproaring
Meanwhile, the
about.
Washington Post reports that the U.S. is delivering another few thousand bombs to Israel.
That's that's what I wanted
Don't
to.
listen to what they say, or don't pay it any grain of salt anyway. Watch what they do.
Right. Well, let's talk about the end game here then, because Israel, the United States is focusing a lot on the aid convoy that was just hit, where I believe seven
That's no big.
so-called, aid workers were killed.
They've killed
Uh,
147 UN employees at this point. What's another few humanitarian workers at this point,
so
right?
there's a lot of, for me, it's pretty dubious, because on the one hand, this is, of course, strongly condemnable. It falls, as you said, completely in line with what Israel has been doing. But then you have this larger regional picture that the United States appears to be not just instigating, but also being a major party to, if not the leading party to, while at the same time acting as if it had nothing to do with what Israel's targeting of Iran in Syria, and of course this larger regional situation that is constantly becoming, even when we think it's rolling back a bit, there's some quiet, it escalates once more. So what's the end game here in your assessment, Mark?
Yeah. So the U.S. government has really only three flavors of politicians. Forget the Democratic Republican political theater of difference, right? That's just for the sheeple who believe they live in a democracy. Um, the Whether we're talking elected politicians, or more pointedly, the want to call it the deep state, as Ben Rode terms it, the blob, the permanent bureaucracy, the foreign policy, intelligence services, and military elite that really make decisions. Certainly with regards to foreign policy and military policy, at least in the United States, they come in three flavors. They all want war with Russia, China, and Iran. But the three flavors prioritize where the attention, where the resources should go among those three potential conflicts. And right now, with the Biden administration, whether they wanted it or not, at least with the power that Victoria Nuland had, it was the Russia hawks that held the sway. I believe that the Biden administration's foreign policy geopolitical plan were to finish off Russia quickly in Ukraine, ignore the Middle East, and then pivot hard to China, which is where they saw the real threat, right? That went terribly wrong for them, right? First, Russia didn't collapse from sanctions or anything else, and has actually been beating all of NATO in one form or another in Ukraine, and that ate up the majority of their attention and resources over the last 4 years. And then, of course, came what was it, October 7th, and the Al-Aqsa flood operation of Hamas, which really shocked most of the people, maybe not certain people in Egyptian intelligence and otherwise, but shocked everyone else. We know that Jake Sullivan, in the week prior to the very week of the Al-Aqsa flood operation, had wrote an essay talking over how nice and quiet the Middle East was, and how it allowed the U.S. to focus on other things. And then events, my dear boy, events. And everything has gone south there, diverting resources and attention that they wanted to spend on Ukraine towards the Middle East. But the U.S., and it must be said, Iran, have been doing everything possible to avoid going into direct conflict with each other, over the last half a year. They've both avoided several incidences that either side would have felt domestically justified, at least, to launching attacks on each other. And neither one has taken the opportunity. In fact, Iran had Kataib Hezbollah stand down in their attacks on U.S. military bases in Iraq and Syria, and the U.S. refrained from launching direct airstrikes into Iranian territory. That really can't be ignored. At the same time, there is one party that is extremely interested in instigating a direct U.S. and Iranian confrontation now. Yeah, there's a few neocons in the U.S. government and outside the government that would like that, but they're not in power right now. Jake Sullivan and Antony Blinken are, and they don't want to be involved in the Middle East. Not now. Benjamin Netanyahu does. He started, this ridiculous over response, as I'm sure Hamas, counted on. Response to the Al-Aqsa flood operation, with this total war on Gaza, which has, very quickly from the beginning become a attempt to ethnically cleanse or genocide the Palestinians out of Gaza. However, when we're talking about what the goals and the standards for winning this conflict are, they're very different because of the rhetoric that has, the universal rhetoric from the Israeli government that has made itself clear to its own public and the world. And as well, the power imbalance between the two, which is, of course, enormous. But Israel has committed themselves to wiping out Hamas in its entirety. Nothing less than that will be seen as victory at this point. Meanwhile, for Hamas to win, all they have to do is survive. If they survive, they've won this conflict. And that's, again, the power imbalance just dictates that, and the rhetoric that has been involved. Benjamin Netanyahu has an approval rating of 19, something ridiculous in the teens right now, 19%, 15%, something like that. It's almost universally acknowledged that as soon as this conflict is over, that he'll be out of office. Right now, he leads a unity government where most of the sizable opposition is actually a part of his government. And realistically, two things. One, no matter who replaced him, who has a real chance of achieving power in Israel, Benny Gantz or anyone else, they wouldn't really be doing anything different than Netanyahu in this situation, although they might be doing it with a little less genocidal rhetoric and a little bit better PR. That's probably what the U.S. wants more than anything else, is them to go about their business more quietly, more of a fig leaf touch, towards, words that will calm the rest of the world down while they go about their butchery and ethnic cleansing. But no one, the political sentiment in Israel, the vast majority of the Israeli people are, the most rabid genocidal hawks right now. I mean, racist genocidal hawks. That's what they are. So they don't hope for any change just because Bibi suddenly disappeared, if he did. But the other reality is none of the other potential people to replace him, including Benny Gantz, actually want to take power right now. They don't want to own this. walk into the middle of this and then be responsible for it? No, they'll let it play out to its end, and then they'll plan on replacing Netanyahu. Netanyahu, therefore, needs the conflict to continue. And not only does he need the conflict to continue, because he can't defeat Hamas without ethnically cleansing the entire Palestinian population from Gaza, because to a one degree or another, simply because of the opposition of the apartheid Israel, if nothing else, the vast majority of the Palestinian people in Gaza support Hamas. Whether they agree with everything they've done or not is moot, right? They are the resistance, and Hamas operates, like an insurgency, like a guerrilla, out of a reservoir of the Palestinian people. Therefore, the only way to defeat Hamas entirely is to get rid of the Palestinian people in Gaza, which is certainly the plan that they would prefer. They want to drive all of the people of the Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip, either across the border into Egypt, or failing that into the Sinai Desert, where they'll hopefully just die of starvation. The Egyptian government is not playing along. Now, the Egyptian government of Sisi has no love for Hamas, right? He gained power by overthrowing the then democratically elected Muslim Brotherhood, and Hamas are essentially just the Muslim Brotherhood of across the border in Palestine. That being said, they also don't want, in a wider sense, they do have a concern, and in a geopolitical sense, certainly, for the continued existence of Palestinian Gaza. If they open up the borders, they know the Israelis will drive all of the Palestinian people across, and never allow them to come back. And then Egypt will be largely responsible for them, which it doesn't want either. So despite all the U.S. pressure and carrot and stick, they have not acquiesced to this, which leaves Netanyahu with a bind. He can't defeat Hamas by without getting rid of the Palestinian people, and at least right now he's not able to get rid of all the Palestinian people, at least not quickly enough. So he's got to escalate his way out of this conflict. And for a long time, he's been talking about attacking southern Lebanon and going after Hezbollah, but there's no guarantee that would drag the U.S., that the U.S. would feel the need to directly intervene in any major way over Hezbollah, because Hezbollah would mostly fight a defensive war anyway. They're not going to storm across the border into Israel. They'll fight on the home ground that they can fight and win on, which is why they haven't stormed across the border to come to the Hamas. That and differences of the fact that Hamas supported the overthrow of the Syrian government a few years ago, and Hezbollah was on the other side. Big religious ideological differences there, just common hatred of Israel. But so the obvious target then that could drag the U.S. Into this conflict directly is to escalate it to Iran. And Israel has been doing this repeatedly over the last half a year. We have seen the assassination of Israeli officials and Israeli IRGC, previously with airstrikes in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iran itself. We have seen this terrorist attack on the memorial of Qasem Soleimani's, assassinated by the Trump administrations, the IRGC Quds Force general. We have seen terrorist attacks on gas pipelines in Iran, whole host. Israel keeps poking and poking and poking Iran, and they must be extremely frustrated that Iran hasn't responded in a big enough way that would necessitate a U.S., a wider conflict that the U.S. would have to enter to protect Israel. So this was this latest attempt. This was this multi-pronged. It's just, first of all, it was a violation, yes, of Syria's sovereignty, an attack on their territory. But I mean, that's practically become the standard. Everyone in the West, at least, has come to the agreement that Syria has no sovereignty. The U.S. is still illegally military occupying the east. Turkey and their 100,000 jihadists are still occupying the north. Israel regularly conducts airstrikes and everything, right? Syria is just, it's normal for Israel to conduct airstrikes in Syria and with no repercussions or consequences. Then they murdered a top Iranian, well, 7 total top Iranian government and military officials, including General Reza Zahedi, whom is the Quds Force commander in charge of Syria and Lebanon. And on top of it, they did it by targeting the Iranian consulate, right? Something protected by all the norms and rules of international law, the Vienna Convention. Okay, yes, the U.S. did it against China back in Belgrade, and we saw that, but we haven't seen anything it's like since. This is a clear and deliberate provocation. They are trying to provoke Iran into an over response that will lead to a wider conflict that will drag the U.S. in. It's plain as day. It's that simple. And up until now, the Iranians have been shown ridiculous, cold-blooded restraint. Now, my bet is that they will continue to do so and let Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel right now stew in its own juices. That said, they will certainly they have their own domestic politics, believe it or not, and there will be enormous upswell of both, the combination of nationalist and religious outrage demanding a response to this. So we're all on, edge here, watching to see how Iran will respond. Will they do the smart and cold-blooded thing and take their revenge at a time and place of their choosing, quietly, with a revenge is the best dish, best served cold philosophy? Or will they, launch some ballistic missiles or something of the sort? My guess would be on the former, but we don't know at this point. So we're once again on the potential for a wider Middle East conflict that could directly involve the U.S. And the U.S. seems unable to separate itself from this because of the power, the political power of Israel, whose interests often seem to be placed above the interests even of the United States. The power of AIPAC to dominate U.S. politics. They regularly tweet and boast about their influence, how many U.S. politicians, they have essentially on their payroll. It's political suicide in the U.S. to say anything against Israel. 2 of the top U.S. political international relations thinkers, John Mearsheimer, the most important and famous international relations scholar alive today, one of the top who has ever existed, whose books, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics and others, are required reading for anyone and everyone in International Relations 101, along with Stephen Walt, who is a top professor of political science at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He's before been the head of the department. Another brilliant realist thinker. They're both realists, which is why they're not in power and never will be, because the liberal / neocon ideologues run U.S. foreign policy in the U.S. But they've both written a book together called The Lobby, which talks about the pernicious effects that AIPAC has controlling U.S. foreign policy. This isn't some type of conspiracy theory about Jews secretly ruling the world, some type of anti-Semitic. It is a hard-nosed, realist look at the political facts. But of course, they were immediately labeled by Israel as anti-Semites. John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, for fuck's sake. But, that's what happens to anyone who criticizes Israel. Even Jeremy Corbyn is somehow an anti-Semite, right? But I recommend anyone interested in the power that AIPAC has over U.S. policy to pick up or at least read a summary or something of this review of this excellent book by Walt and Mearsheimer, who are 2 people that, if more people in the U.S. paid attention to the foreign policy and the analysis that these two give, we would not be in so many of the problems in the world that we are today. But now I'm going to be real cold-blooded, realpolitik. A wider U.S. involvement in a war against Iran would be tremendously geopolitically useful to Russia or to China. The conflict already has been. It's diverted U.S. resources, including artillery shells, tens of thousands, bombs, air defense interceptor missiles that could have gone to Ukraine have been diverted to Israel instead. And that's just with the U.S. not being directly involved. China as well. If the U.S. got involved in a war with Iran now, there would be, yes, enormous economic and other casualties. Imagine the price of oil and everything. But they could be reassured that the U.S. would not be able to intentionally provoke a conflict with them over Taiwan and the Chinese, South China Sea for another decade. They're already benefiting from the conflict with Russia today with the U.S. focus and expenditure of resources there. And by that point, there would be no question that the U.S. could defeat China. They probably already can't, but in 10 years, the gap would be irreversible. So it is not in the U.S.'s wider geopolitical interest to engage in a conflict with Iran there now. But that's a logical perspective, and logic has obviously not always dominated U.S. Foreign policy actions over the most recent years. It's far more driven by the aforementioned supremacist ideology of exceptionalism. So we'll just have to wait and see what Iran does, what the U.S. does, what NATO does in Ukraine. But we are in a much worse position right now than we were 2 years ago. And we're in a much worse position now than we were at any point in the Cold War, including the Cuba Missile Crisis.
Yeah, this is something that Russia has actually recently acknowledged, that especially just relations between Russia and the West are at their worst point, worse than in the Cold War.